U.S., NATO trying to turn Central Asian into foothold to threaten Russia. The U.S. and NATO are trying to turn the Central Asian region into a foothold for threatening Russia's southern borders, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Galuzin said on Tuesday. The U.S. and NATO are trying to engage Central Asian countries in so-called partner programs and training and do not stop speaking about the resumption of joint exercises in the region and the deployment of their military infrastructure, the diplomat said. These efforts obviously aim at containing Russia, separating the region from our country and gradually turning it into a springboard for threatening our southern borders, Galuzin said at Valdai Discussion Club. Japanese public gathers to call halt to nuke wastewater discharge plan. Hundreds of Japanese people on Tuesday gathered at multiple locations in Tokyo to protest the government's plan to discharge nuclear-contaminated water from the crippled Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant into the sea, demanding immediate suspension of the plan. Residents from prefectural regions, including Tokyo, Fukushima, and Nagasaki, gathered in front of the headquarters of Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, shouting slogans such as "Don't pollute the ocean," "Protect fisheries," and "Guard the future." There were various banners and flags with slogans that read "Don't discharge polluted water into the sea," "Don't pollute the ocean for all," and "The sea is not the toilet for nuclear power plants." The Japanese government, which regarded discharging nuclear polluted water into the sea as the initial conclusion, has been making all kinds of excuses, stressing that other discharge methods would not work or could not preserve nuclear polluted water on land, said Kazuyoshi Sato, co-director of Koreamai, a Japanese citizens' conference to condemn further pollution of the ocean and one of the rally's organizers. Sato, also a resident of Fukushima Prefecture, said in his speech that the Japanese government is now spending tens of billions of yen to publicize the discharge plan through various media platforms, but the public, not convinced of such wrong propaganda, will not agree to the decision. Through today's actions, we are raising our voice against the dumping plan to the whole world, he said. Showdown, another co-director of the group, read and submitted a petition to a TEPCO representative, demanding the company abide by the agreement with local associations such as Fukushima Prefectural Federation of Fisheries Cooperative Associations and not to discharge nuclear polluted water into the ocean without the understanding and consent of relevant parties. The petition required disclosure of information such as the concentration and total amount of all radionuclides and reassessment of the radiation's impact on the marine environment and creatures. It also demanded fundamental countermeasures from TEPCO, such as exploring the construction of large water storage tanks for long-term nuclear polluted water preservation and promoting the practical application of tritium separation technology. The rally held in front of the second member's office building of the House of Representatives later during the day was joined by 5 Japanese lawmakers from opposition parties, including the Constitutional Democratic Party and the Social Democratic Party. Mizuho Fukushima, head of the Social Democratic Party, told the crowd that radioactive materials, once discharged, cannot be retrieved, so they must be intensively managed. Such materials would be beyond management if they are discharged into the ocean. We can't allow such a thing to happen, she said. Rushdie slams book publishers over censorship. Making James Bond politically correct is almost comical, the author of the Satanic Verses insisted. British author and freedom of expression advocate Salman Rushdie has blasted publishers who amend old books with the stated goal of protecting modern readers from being offended. He argued that oversensitive readers can always opt for something else. Rushdie addressed the issue on Monday evening while receiving the prestigious British Book Award for Freedom to Publish. In his televised acceptance speech, which he delivered via a video link from New York, the writer sounded the alarm over what he perceives as a growing acceptance of censorship in Western nations. In the U.S., he said. He noted the extraordinary attack on libraries and books for children in schools. The attack on the idea of libraries themselves. Conservative lawmakers in some American states have sought to purge from school libraries books that they consider inappropriate for minors, as they depict sexual relations and other mature content. I have to say it's also been alarming to see publishers looking to, how should I put this, burglarize the works of such people as Roald Dahl and Ian Fleming, Rushdie added. I have to say the idea that James Bond can be made politically correct is almost comical. Books by both authors have been scrubbed for their new editions to remove supposedly offensive language. Last year Roald Dahl's children's classics, including Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Matilda, were stripped of some words, such as fat and ugly, in a move that Rushdie blasted as absurd censorship at the time. The publisher later agreed to print the original versions in addition to the updated versions, after a public outcry. Following the same pattern, the James Bond books had negative language about African criminals removed, according to British media. Publishers are now hiring sensitivity readers to flag supposedly problematic language in literary works. I think this has to be resisted. Books have to come to us from their time and be of their time, and if that's difficult for you to take, don't read them, read another book. But don't try to remake yesterday's work in the light of today's attitudes, Rushdie argued. The Indian-born author, 75, has drawn headlines after several attempts were made on his life, including a stabbing last year on a stage in New York. Since 1988 Rushdie has been subjected to death threats over his book The Satanic Verses, which has been branded blasphemous by some adherents of Islam. Is the belief in the U.S. that owning a gun ensures safety a delusion? Gun violence continues to plague the U.S. as communities grapple with the devastating consequences of shootings across the nation. One of the most tragic events recently happened in Allen, Texas, where a gunman bearing Nazi tattoos opened fire at a suburban Dallas shopping mall. 8 people lost their lives, including a 3-year-old child. Every year, 43,000 Americans die from gun violence, according to Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, a U.S. public interest law center and nonprofit organization. Guns are also the leading cause of death among children under 18. From schools and shopping malls to city streets and neighborhoods, no corner seems immune to the menace of gun-related incidents. Mass shootings, in particular, have captured headlines and left scars on the national psyche. There have been 225 mass shootings as of May 15, 2023, data from the Gun Violence Archive shows. Since 2018, the U.S. has experienced an average of over 1 mass shooting a day, and the number shows an upward trend, according to the Giffords Law Center. Behind the increasing gun violence, the U.S. is the most heavily armed civilian population by far in the world. There are more guns than people in the country. According to an estimate by Small Arms Survey, a Geneva-based organization, there are about 393 million privately owned firearms in the U.S., which is higher than the country's population of about 330 million. The extensive ownership of firearms has been closely associated with the upsurge in gun violence, said Du Hua, an associate professor at the School of History at Wuhan University. He said the increase in gun violence can be attributed to the rise in firearm purchases driven by concerns for personal safety. Mass shootings instill fear in the general public, which is often intensified by paranoid conspiracy theories suggesting that the government intends to seize firearms. As a result, people rush to purchase guns, leading to an increase in the availability of weapons and a higher risk of more mass shootings. This pattern can be seen in Texas. Following the Uvalde shooting in May 2022 that killed 19 children and 2 teachers at Robb Elementary School, FBI background checks in Texas surged by 17% in the subsequent month of June. In most developed countries, gun ownership has been traditionally centered on hunting. However, about 2/3 of U.S. gun owners cite protection as a major reason for owning a gun, as revealed by a 2017 survey by the Pew Research Center. When firearms are readily accessible, there is an increased potential for their misuse, whether it is intentional or accidental, said Du. Nevertheless, several reasons stymie better gun control, which is the key to eliminating gun violence. One of them is the influence of gun interest groups in U.S. politics. The National Rifle Association, NRA, remains the most powerful gun lobby in the country. Backed by a substantial budget, it wields significant influence in shaping gun policy. Another reason is political polarization. With the two major political parties growing increasingly adversarial, the prospects of finding common ground on important political matters have become challenging. Also, the substantial power held by individual states further complicates forming a unified national gun control policy. Amid the ongoing tragedy of frequent mass shootings, firearms continue to be deeply entrenched in American culture. In the past, firearms were mostly sold to the military. This changed after the Civil War when more people suddenly had experience with guns, and more guns were in circulation, according to Philip Gorski, a sociology professor at Yale University. In the wake of wartime production, gun manufacturers faced a shortage of customers. So they started marketing guns as a means of self-defense, gradually evolving them into a symbol of masculinity. The prevalence of guns in American culture can also be attributed to the rise of the conservative movement, which traces back to the mid-1930s. In recent years, modern American conservatism has evolved beyond a mere social trend of thought, rather, it has become a grassroots mobilization movement, said Du. Conservatives strongly uphold the principle of white supremacy and emphasize the revered status of guns among white individuals. They view them as symbols of individuality and freedom. Many Americans hold their right to bear arms, enshrined in the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, as sacred. Even though the interpretations of this provision vary, it emerges as a significant institutional challenge in gun control, Du explained. Does owning a gun guarantee safety? Despite the persistent arguments from gun rights activists, backed by the NRA's long-standing narrative that a good guy with a gun can stop gun violence, research has consistently shown otherwise. One of the most famous studies includes a 2015 study conducted by the Harvard Injury Control Research Center, which showed that individuals using guns for self-defense accounted for less than 1% of the 14,000 crimes analyzed from 2007 to 2011. The study also found that having a firearm in the house does not necessarily provide effective protection during dangerous situations. On the contrary, it tends to amplify other risks. Individuals who confronted attackers with guns were more prone to getting injured compared to those who called the police or ran away. Another big concern is gun-related suicide. In a study published in 2020 in the New England Journal of Medicine, researchers tracked over 26 million adults living in California for 12 years, monitoring whether they buy handguns and if they died by suicide. They found that those who purchased handguns were over 3 times more likely to die by suicide compared to those who hadn't bought guns. Similarly, women who had purchased handguns were more than 7 times more likely to die by suicide. Easy access to firearms, especially handguns, is a significant risk factor for suicide, the research concluded. As incidents of gun violence continue to rise in frequency, the issue of reconciling gun ownership and safety has drawn a new round of media coverage and sparked public discussion. According to a recent CBS News poll, 3 in 4 Americans believe that mass shootings are preventable if we really tried rather than something they have to accept as part of a free society. And around half of Americans say guns make their country dangerous. Meanwhile, 61% said the political debate over guns makes them feel frustrated, and 45% say they feel angry. Paradoxically, addressing gun violence entails a gradual and challenging process, given that it stems from deeply rooted cultural factors within the country. Germany won't send fighter jets to Ukraine, senior MP. The chair of the Bundestag's Defense Committee cited complex pilot training as an impediment. Germany will not deliver fighter jets to Ukraine, the chair of the Bundestag's Defense Committee, Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann, has stated. The lawmaker stressed, however, that Berlin had already given the green light along with several other NATO members for the transfer of older, Soviet-designed military aircraft to Kiev. Speaking to the Deutschlandfunk public broadcaster on Tuesday, Strack-Zimmermann stated that she and most of my colleagues said relatively early on that I don't see tornadoes or Eurofighters in Ukrainian airspace. The lawmaker then cited the complex training that would be required for Ukrainian pilots to operate the warplanes. In contrast, Soviet-designed fighter jets sourced from former Eastern German stockpiles have proved to be more useful, she claimed. Strack-Zimmermann suggested that if Ukraine were to be supplied with US-made F-16s, it would be a considerable contribution, although she noted that Berlin does not operate this type of aircraft. According to the lawmaker, Germany is doing all it can to support Ukraine militarily, but cannot be expected to provide the full range of weapons that Kiev requires. On Sunday, Politico cited an anonymous staffer from French President Emmanuel Macron's office as claiming that any discussion of Western fighter jet deliveries to Ukraine is a bit premature. During a visit by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to London on Monday, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak pledged more military aid, including a program aimed at honing the skills of Ukrainian fighter jet pilots. According to a statement, the initiative will go hand in hand with UK efforts to work with other countries on providing F-16 jets. Ukraine has increased its calls for Western-made military aircraft in the past several months, although those requests have yet to be granted. Several NATO member states have provided Ukraine with Soviet-designed fighter jets instead. Russia has repeatedly warned Western nations that by providing Kiev with more advanced weapons, they risk getting dragged into a direct military confrontation. Moscow has also insisted that no amount of Western military aid will deter Russia from achieving its goals in Ukraine. Russia's Kinzhal missile destroys Patriot system in Kiev. The Russian Kinzhal hypersonic missile has destroyed the Patriot air defense system in Kiev, the Defense Ministry said on Tuesday. The high-precision strike of the Kinzhal hypersonic missile system in the city of Kiev hit a US-made Patriot anti-aircraft missile system, the ministry said in a statement. The ministry also said that the Russian air defense systems have intercepted 7 Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles over the past day. In addition, the ministry said that Ukraine lost up to 215 military in the Donetsk direction over the past 24 hours, while fighting in western part of Itmovsk is ongoing. ExxonMobil settles Indonesian torture suit. The oil giant allegedly paid soldiers to brutalize 11 villagers in North Asia 20 years ago. 11 Indonesians known only as John and Jane Doe settled a lawsuit against oil giant ExxonMobil on Monday for an undisclosed sum following a 2-decades-long courtroom fight that saw the multinational accused of hiring members of the Indonesian military to torture villagers near its massive Arun field in North Asia. ExxonMobil's soldiers, who worked as security for the gas field, allegedly forced pregnant women to jump repeatedly before sexually assaulting them, and inflicted burns, shocks, and knife wounds on men. The group also claimed they had to watch family members be shot in front of them. Even a traveling fish merchant who stopped at the Arun facility to sell his wares was fatally shot, according to witnesses, while sexual assault and physical abuse by the guards was reportedly commonplace. ExxonMobil condemns human rights violations in any form. Those include the actions asserted in this case against the Indonesian military, a company spokesperson told AFP. It should be noted while there were no allegations that any employee directly harmed any of the plaintiffs, the settlement brings closure for all parties. The company profited handsomely from the Arun field, one of the world's largest, during the period of the alleged torture. The abuses were said to have occurred during a period of widespread national unrest that was brutally put down by the US-backed military dictatorship of General Suharto. The torture case was finally set to go to trial at the end of the month in Washington after being shuffled between jurisdictions for years. It finally found a home in Washington, D.C. under U.S. District Court Judge Royce Lamberth, who rejected a request from ExxonMobil to preempt the trial with a ruling in its favor. The settlement resolves all matters, according to a joint filing from opposing counsel. The villagers, who have remained anonymous due to threats against them and their neighbors since filing suit in 2001, celebrated the conclusion of the case. "We are so pleased that now, on the eve of trial, we were able to secure a measure of justice for them and their families," lead counsel Agnieszka Friesman told reporters. Pentagon has Iron Dome system ready to ship out to Ukraine. The U.S. acquired 2 Iron Dome batteries from Israel in late 2020, sending one to Guam in 2021 to get a sense of how the system might perform against Chinese missiles. Israel has used the air defense system extensively against garage-built rockets and drones fired by Palestinian militias, but has never tested it against state actors. The United States has an Iron Dome system ready to ship out to Ukraine if Kiev asks for it, U.S. Army Space and Missile Defense Commander Daniel Karbler has indicated. "Our 2 Iron Dome batteries that we have right now, one completed its new equipment training, new equipment fielding. It is prepared for deployment. The second one is wrapping up its new equipment fielding right now, so the Army does have 1 battery available for deployment to Ukraine pending a request for it," Karbler said, answering a question from Senator Angus King during a meeting of the Senate Subcommittee on Strategic Forces last week. "Obviously, missile defense is very important to the Ukrainians," King said, while formulating his question. "Why isn't Iron Dome being deployed to Ukraine? We helped pay for it. We spent something like $3 billion for Israel to develop it, $500 million a year my understanding is. Wouldn't this be a very important resource for the Ukrainians, since their principal problem right now is air defense?" the senator asked. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy John Plum told King that to date, the U.S. has focused on missile defense systems from its own stocks to send to Ukraine. "You know, we've supplied Patriot batteries, for example, we've made significant investments in missile defense and we've encouraged allies to do the same," the official said. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu expressed reluctance to entertain sending military equipment to Ukraine last month amid reports of growing pressure from Washington to do so. Tel Aviv's current stance follows a reversal from Netanyahu's comments in January that Tel Aviv might send an Iron Dome to Kiev. Kiev pleaded with Israel to send Iron Domes to the country last year, with officials saying that Ukraine would be ready to buy the system and wasn't looking for a donation. In early 2022, on the eve of the escalation in Ukraine, Israeli media reported that Tel Aviv halted an attempt by the U.S. to transfer its Iron Dome batteries to Ukraine amid concerns over how Moscow might respond. First introduced into service with the Israeli military in 2011, the Iron Dome has been used extensively in Israel's battles against Palestinian and Lebanese militias armed mostly with small rockets and drones. Israel has touted the system as one of the best air defense systems in the world. However, independent analyses of its fire-to-shoot-down ratio have raised questions about just how effective it is. With one study of its use against Hamas rockets during the May 2021 conflict in Gaza revealing that the system had been partially overwhelmed by the Palestinian militia's mass firing of rockets. Iron Dome batteries consist of radar and command and control modules and 3 launchers, the latter armed with 20 Tamir interceptor missiles apiece. Israel has about 12 Iron Dome systems in its arsenal. U.S. China had secret submarine showdown near Hong Kong around Jan. 6 events, report. The cat-and-mouse game between U.S. and Chinese forces off the Chinese coast reached a dangerous point on January 5, 2021, when U.S. aircraft began harassing Chinese submarines, prompting a Chinese show of force. The showdown happened amid a backdrop of high anxieties about the prospect of then-US President Donald Trump starting a war. The incident was recently revealed by a Chinese journal, although the report was sparse on the details. According to the outlet, 3 U.S. Navy aircraft launched an intense hunt for Chinese submarines in the waters between Hong Kong and the ring-shaped atoll known in English as Pratas and in Chinese as Donsha, about 190 miles off the Chinese coast. The People's Liberation Army, PLA, was conducting naval exercises in the area at the time and after the U.S. aircraft dropped a slew of sonar buoys designed to pinpoint the location of submarines, the Chinese military dispatched a force to the region, the consist of which remains classified. The sonars were dropped close to Pratas, which is controlled by the government in Taiwan, which enjoys unofficial U.S. backing but is regarded by Beijing as an illegitimate rebel force on Chinese soil, adding another provocative element to the already dangerous incident. As the U.S. and Chinese forces came closer together, the U.S. aircraft began destroying their own sonar buoys to prevent them from falling into Chinese hands, where they might be analyzed for their weaknesses. At one point during the showdown, one of the U.S. aircraft flew just 93 miles from Hong Kong, one of the closer passes made to the Chinese coast by U.S. surveillance aircraft. U.S. aircraft combed South China Sea. The U.S. aircraft were not named in the report. But according to the South China Sea Probing Initiative, CSPI, a Beijing-based think tank focused on the waterway, the U.S. Navy flew two kinds of sub-hunters over the South China Sea that month. The P-8A Poseidon, a maritime patrol aircraft based on the Boeing 737 but modified to carry specialized sub-hunting equipment like sonar buoys and torpedoes. And the P-3 Orion, an older aircraft that also carries a magnetic anomaly detector for spotting the distortions in Earth's magnetic field produced by a large steel object, such as a submarine. The SCAPI recorded 70 U.S. spy plane sorties across the South China Sea in January 2021, including 4 on January 5, the day of the showdown, although its data did not say which planes flew that day. The U.S. Navy has dramatically increased its surveillance of the South China Sea in recent years after the Pentagon named the waterway as the likely locale for a showdown between Washington and Beijing, both politically and militarily. Several nations have overlapping territorial and maritime claims on island chains in the region, the largest of which is China's, delineated by a 9-dash line that encompasses the majority of the South China Sea. Those sorties have continued, with SCAPI reporting 58 such missions last month, including submarine hunters like the P-8A Poseidon, as well as signals intelligence and radar emissions monitoring aircraft. Fears of attempted U.S. provocation. The January 2021 showdown didn't happen in a vacuum, though. Tensions were already sky-high between Washington and Beijing, and the events of the following day only sent them higher. On January 6, thousands of Trump supporters breached the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., as Congress was certifying the results of the November 2020 U.S. presidential election. Trump had claimed his loss in the election was illegitimate due to fraud by the Democrats and encouraged his followers to stop the steal. Their efforts failed and the demonstrators were cleared from the legislative building by police and U.S. troops, who garrisoned the capital city with more than 25,000 men in the aftermath. However, for Beijing, the concern was far greater, since several months before the election, senior Chinese military brass had feared Trump might try to hold on to power by provoking some kind of incident that would give him emergency powers. One of the scenarios most feared was an attack on Chinese positions in the South China Sea, or an attempt to goad Chinese forces there into attacking U.S. forces. U.S. military leaders spoke with their Chinese counterparts several times during that period in an attempt to defuse tensions, one of which came 2 days after the insurrection, on January 8, 2021. U.S. Gen. Mark A. Milley, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, spoke on the phone for 90 minutes with his Chinese counterpart, PLA Gen. Li Ziuoken, chief of the Joint Staff Department of the Central Military Commission, to reassure him that the U.S. military would not allow another attempted seizure of power. Milley later described him as unusually rattled. Afterward, Milley reportedly told U.S. Navy ADM Philip S. Davidson, the commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, canceled operations that the Chinese might see as provocative in a further effort to calm things down in the region in the wake of the January 5 showdown near Pratas. While Chinese anxieties relaxed somewhat after Trump left office later that month and U.S. President Joe Biden was sworn in, tensions between Washington and Beijing have remained high. Biden's administration has kept to the strategy laid out by Trump for great power competition with Russia and China, stepping up diplomatic efforts to isolate China internationally and increasing U.S. military support for Taiwan. Beijing regards Taiwan as a rebellious Chinese province destined to be reunited with the mainland, and thus sees U.S. support for Taiwan as interference in internal Chinese affairs. That is also why the January 5th incident was so provocative. Taiwan controls Pratas and has long feared a PLA seizure of the island, which has no permanent residents, would serve as a prelude to a full invasion of Taiwan itself. Watch Russian MT-12 Rapira guns batter Ukrainian positions. The guns primarily use an F-15 high-explosive shell, weighing almost 30 kilograms, with 16.7 kilograms of explosive filler inside. They can be fired at ranges up to 8.2 kilometers, causing massive damage to both enemy infantry and defensive structures. The Russian Defense Ministry has shared video footage of Russian artillery hammering enemy positions with high-explosive shells from cover during the special military operation in Ukraine. The clip posted by the military shows servicemen firing MT-12 Rapira towed guns, also known as 229 or 12. The MT-12 is a classic Soviet anti-tank gun, still very effective as a light artillery piece, given that it has a relatively large 100 mm caliber for its weight.